and welcome to Dialogue. As promised, President Trump has imposed tariffs on major U.S. trade partners, including Canada, Mexico, and China. While the 25% tariffs on its neighbors were temporarily put on hold after both countries threatened retaliation, the 10% tariffs on China moved forward. These measures have sparked intense debate about their economic, political, and strategic consequences. Do tariffs truly serve the U.S. interest in rebuilding its manufacturing capacity? What will be the impact on international trade and global supply chains? And how will these policies affect U.S. relations with countries like China, Mexico, and Canada? Join us for our discussion live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Professor Gong from University of International Business and Economics, Radhika Desai, visiting professor at the Department of International Development at the London School of Economics, and Anthony Chan, former JPMorgan chief economist. Welcome to the show. Well, Anthony, I will start with you. For people who are outside the U.S., so what do you think is the economic rationale behind Trump's decision, to impose 25% tariffs on neighbors, Canada and Mexico, 10% on Chinese products?
Well, the economic rationale is not a strong argument for the United States. They basically impose these tariffs or propose tariffs in reaction to national security concerns. They were worried that somehow the immigration flows were causing a risk. The fentanyl flows were also causing a risk. And they felt that by proposing these taxes, they would be able to change the behavior of these countries in terms of those factors, migration and fentanyl flows. But the economic rationale may be there, but not a very strong argument to make that case.
So, Radhika, you're from Canada. Do you think there's a problem? Like Canada somehow is weak in terms of border control, in terms of somehow facilitating, fentanyl flow into the U.S. or illegal immigrants into the U.S.?
Not at all. I think that I agree with what Anthony said, and I would add that basically there is no economic rationale. A lot of these tariffs and also this posturing over fentanyl, immigrants, etc., has to do with the electoral promises that Trump has made. And Trump doesn't even really have a coherent economic program. And so essentially, he wants to appear to be engaged in a flurry of activity to protect the interests of Americans, but his accusations about fentanyl, etc., against all the countries are to some or the other degree trumped up. So in the case of Canada, a tiny, tiny proportion of the fentanyl that actually ends up in the United States passes through Canada. A tiny proportion of the immigrants who arrive in the United States illegally pass through Canada. But nevertheless, he has made, it's a bit like some sadistic person who is shooting on the floor in order to make their opponents dance. And Canada is dancing. Canada has promised to appoint a fentanyl czar. Canada has promised to beef up border security with 10,000 more personnel. Canada has agreed to spend $1.3 billion. For what? To please Trump? I should say that, of course, the other thing that's happening is that Canada and Mexico, of course, are uniquely vulnerable to Trump's threats. And of course, these threats coming from such a close trading partner to which Canada sends 75% of their exports has really made Canadians sit up and look. And immediately there's been talk about how we must reduce interprovincial barriers, increase trade within Canada, so Canada supplies oil to the United States, whereas Western Canada could be supplying Eastern Canada with the same oil. Western Canada could also be supplying Asian countries with oil, etc. So all of these options are now suddenly becoming very important to discuss for Canadians.
Yeah, Radhika, are you saying that basically, despite the fact that those threatened tariffs have been put on hold, you are saying there is a consequence of such threat from Trump?
Absolutely. I think that Trump's erratic behavior only underlines how much the United States is in crisis. If it's not Trump, it's Trump today, it could be somebody else tomorrow, because as I said, there is no serious economic program. The tariffs are not going to magically reindustrialize the United States unless there is a serious industrial policy, unless there is serious control over the big US capitalists who are much more interested in making money through speculation and predatory lending than in making money by producing anything. So unless some very serious measures are taken, and I don't see them being taken remotely by the Trump administration or by the Biden administration, I don't think America's economic woes will be solved, which means nor will the United States crisis. So I think that Canada and Mexico both need long-term structural solutions to the problem that has suddenly erupted on their doorsteps.
Well, John, if you look at North America, of course, there is this U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, formerly known as NAFTA. It's a free trade deal. Do you think the Trump's proposed threat of tariffs somehow violate that kind of the deal, the trade agreement?
Well, he's already torn apart that piece of paper. That deal is no longer in effect anymore. And I think this is not the gravest violation of an international treaty he has signed. For example, recently, just a few days ago, he's calling for a solution for Gaza that, according to the president from the foreign ministry from France and as well as from Germany, it's a grave violation of United Nations Charter. So I think from Trump's perspective, he really doesn't care. I think
the rules.
Under the name of America First, anything can be torn apart, anything can be violated. So I think this is not going to be the first one, and it certainly is not going to be the last one.
Well, Anthony, of course, after having conversation with the leaders from Mexico and Canada, so there will be a pause for 30 days of those tariffs. Of course, Trump will claim that's a victory for the U.S. Then, after 30 days, what will happen?
Well, I think that these negotiations continue to take place. I think that if you look at the actions that took place, it would suggest that President Trump is more interested in gaining concessions than imposing those tariffs. So I think at the end of the day, he would probably prefer to get more concessions and not have to impose the tariffs, because the tariffs are, to some extent, mutually destructive for all countries, because it leads to less efficiency and greater costs associated with those tariffs for all countries. So under the best of all possible worlds, we don't get those tariffs, but he's keeping those threats alive just to extract more concessions, no doubt in my mind.
Well, Anthony, what kind of concessions you are talking about here?
Well, I think that whether one agrees or disagrees with this view, the president has this notion that trade deficits with countries are bad and surplus with countries is a good thing. And we have a trade deficit with Mexico, and we have one with Canada, even though the one with Canada is mostly due to energy. If you take out the energy products, the United States actually has more than a $30 billion surplus with Canada. And much of the trade deficit that we have with Mexico is basically a shift in supply chains as we moved to diversify supply chains in recent years away from China. The trade deficit moved on to Mexico.
So, John, what's next? 30 days later, of course, Mexico and Canada have promised to take action, for example, against the so-called illegal immigrants or flow of fentanyl. And then, do you think there will be a new deal between these countries, or at least to give Trump some victory?
Well, I think it's quite likely. I think negotiations probably underway intensely right now. Certainly, I think Trump's demand for these two countries probably goes well beyond just fentanyl and illegal immigration. I think I'm in total agreement with Anthony that he wants to address the trade deficit problem. Whether it's going to lead to a new USMCA or I don't know, a new trade agreement, I'm a little bit skeptical because a trade agreement has a lot of details. It needs time to be worked out. I don't think that within 30 days it can be done that quickly. But I think we have to get used to the way that Trump governs. Everything's going to be makeshift. Solutions and actions. It's just going to be everyday hassle. We're going to have deal with this kind of a situation that he's going to say something outrageous from the White House, and the rest of the world just scratch his head and think about how to deal with it. So this is probably the new normal we're going to deal with from Washington.
Radhika, I think you agree. Probably this will be the new normal from Washington, and but given how important the U.S. is, how large the economy is, that will affect the rest of the world. So, how do you look at this possible impact, on this global trade, global supply chain?
Well, I think that, we have become so used to saying that the United States is so important and blah, blah, and so on, that we have not noticed the extent to which its economic weight in the world economy has diminished. Just in the run-up to these events, as everybody was talking about Trump's threatened tariffs, the Financial Times, some columnists there made a very important, cited a very important statistic. The United States' share of total imports of the world is the highest indeed, but it is only slightly higher than that of the European Union and slightly higher than China. It stands at 15.9% of world imports. And other than Canada and Mexico, which will indeed have to suffer a deep crisis if Trump's tariffs do hit, other than that, the rest of the world is not so dependent on exporting to the United States that they cannot fairly quickly reorder their economy. So the more Trump behaves like this, the more he will give the trading partners of the United States an incentive to be able to become more resilient, independent of the need to rely on exports to the US. And therefore, the more it will diminish the overall weight and influence of the US economy. And I'd like to mention one other thing, because you asked about what will be the effect of the tariffs. If these such tariffs are indeed imposed and increased, because, Trump is going to talk to President Xi, I believe, today or tomorrow. And apparently, if he's not happy with what happens, he will increase tariffs on China. Well, fine, Mr. Trump, please increase the tariffs. But ultimately, it will increase inflation in the United States. That will essentially force the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates higher for even longer, and that could also risk a financial crisis in the United States. So all of these are possibilities if Trump actually carries out his threats of tariffs.
So Anthony, of course, as Radhika mentioned, there's 10% tariffs on Chinese goods. Actually, that went in effect Tuesday night, U.S. time. People are guessing the two sides are probably discussing with each other what's the next step. China has taken countermeasures against the U.S. And so how do you look at the prospect of reaching any kind of a deal or the negotiation between China and the U.S.?
I actually am cautiously optimistic, just like we were able to secure a peace with Canada and Mexico, that we could do the same with China. I think that there have been some kind things said about President Xi. It's clear that President Trump has said that he respects President Xi. He likes him. He considers him a friend. And when you hear that kind of rhetoric, it suggests that that is an environment in which some deal could take place. Obviously, when you're dealing with China, is a much bigger player than Canada or Mexico. So the seriousness of reaching a deal and not letting this escalate out of hand is quite important. So I believe that there is a good opportunity for both countries to meet each other halfway.
John, are you also kind of optimistic about reaching a deal?
I'm a little bit reserved about optimism. I think on the surface it's fentanyl, and of course in the background there's also the long-term Sino-U.S. trade relationship, it's unbalanced. We know that United States seems to be too much dependent on China, and there's a national security issue. He wants it to be, over the long run, to be somewhat slowly decoupled from China, or at least less dependent on China. These things are in the background, but I think in the short run, there's also the issue about the conflict in Ukraine. And remember, President Trump, the first post he put on the X platform with respect to China is about the conflict in Ukraine, right? So I would be surprised that the U.S. side doesn't raise this issue with respect to the conflict in Ukraine in the trade negotiation. And if we talk about the tariffs being a means to an end, what is that end? One of the ends, I think, potentially could be the conflict in Ukraine. China's cooperation with Washington try to bring a ceasefire to the conflict in Ukraine. Now, this is something, it's very difficult for the White House to publicly talk about it, because if it does, it's going to put Beijing in a very awkward situation. So, but beneath the table, I would speculate that this is probably one of the items on the agenda. And this is something very difficult for China to make a compromise. I think what the United States is asking is to essentially curtail back the trade relationship with Russia. And I think from China's perspective, why should we, right? I mean, it is
but that's a legitimate trade relationship.
It's a legitimate, normal trade relationship with Russia as much as with Ukraine. So why should be, China subject to this kind of a curtailing back because of the conflict somehow in Ukraine. So I think it's very difficult for China to make a compromise on that. I mean, this is not very talked about in public, but I would speculate this could be a major bottleneck for the two sides to reach an agreement.
Well, Radhika, I know you also follow the Chinese economic development. First term Trump administration, of course, that was the start of the so-called trade war, and now another term. So, do you think China, let's say, is getting prepared for the return of Trump, or do you think China is in a stronger or in a weaker position compared to the first Trump administration?
Well, I would say that if you read the Western papers, which are constantly emphasizing the slowdown in China's growth and the demand woes that it is suffering and so on, you'd think that China is not very well prepared. But China has already been under sanctions now for more than 8 years, since Trump's first term. So in that sense, China has already been prepared by the United States itself to suffer this additional blows, whatever Trump may wish to dish out. But I would say that also as a result of these sanctions and so on, in a certain sense, China is already more resilient, because China's reliance on exports to the United States is smaller today than it was before. And today it's like less than 3% of Chinese GDP relies on exporting to the United States. And it's not like there are not other people willing to buy Chinese goods, given that they are cost competitive, they are of high quality, etc. And so I would say again that China, of course, will not have no problems with it. China will be hurt, but it will not be such a big blow as it will be to some other countries. So I think China is very well prepared. And I think that while, of course, China is taking the right attitude, China actually has not caved under. China has complained to the WTO and so on. So I think responding in these measured ways, in these proper ways, will serve China well in the future as well, in its relations with its other partners, whose importance will rise as that of the United States diminishes if Trump carries out his threats.
Anthony, what do you think are probably on the negotiation table between the two sides? And also, what is the priority for the Trump administration in its negotiation with the Chinese side? Is it still the so-called trade deficit issue?
I think the number one priority for the Trump administration is to appear to be stronger, appear to negotiate and get what they want. That's number one. Obviously, they'll throw out a lot of arguments out there: the trade deficit, the fentanyl, the illegal immigration. I mean, they just talk about a lot of things. But at the end of the day, it's trying to make a deal that somehow makes the United States appear to be stronger. But I agree with Radhika. We have seen that countries like China have already moved to increase their trade with their southern nation partners. And I think that at some point, Canada will, in fact, move to diversify their energy exports either internally or into Asia. For Mexico, it's a longer road simply because over 80% of their exports come to the United States, a little bit less for Canada, but Canada has other options. But we should not lose sight of the fact that Mexico has more than a dozen free trade agreements with over close to 50 countries. So they can also move in that direction. It takes time, but these are all things that are on the table. And again, all this stuff increases inefficiency, hurts global economic growth, and hurts the countries because some of the estimates from the nonpartisan think tanks suggest that if these trade tariffs go into effect, it can cause a recession in Canada, cause a recession in Mexico. And obviously, it's not a benefit for China, but also in the United States. Some of these non-partisan think tanks suggest that it can increase inflation in the United States anywhere from 0.4 to 0.7% in the next 12 months. Granted, it's a one-time effect, but it is an increase in inflation. And over the next 12 months, it could hurt GDP growth by about 1%, and especially if you get retaliation, which we know we're going to get from all countries involved. So it is a mutually destructive action to move in this direction.
Well, good point. I mean, if you look at the discussion in the international media, of course, like China relies on the U.S. market. Well, U.S. stress is like we rely on China too much, right? Basically, it's a mutual reliance on each other. I mean, that's trade, right? It's about two sides, buying or selling stuff or services there. So if there's a problem, usually you follow the rules and you go to the WTO or you have a bilateral negotiation. John, of course, we are probably going to see more tariffs. For example, Trump also talked about the European Union, right? Mm-hmm. He talked about certainly imposing tariffs on the European Union. So more tariffs, but I think there's earlier you said that it doesn't care about the rules. I mean, WTO or other kind of agreement, do they still hold water? Do they still are there, helping stabilize?
Now, I don't think the Trump administration is going to be constrained by these treaties or these protocols. We talk about tariffs and trade war being a lose-lose situation for both sides, right? I don't think Trump buys into that theory at all. Mm-hmm. I think he thinks that the tariff is a good thing. I think honestly, he earnestly believes that tariff is a good thing. Now remember, he is thinking about tariff as a means to bring manufacturing back to the United States to reindustrialize. We use the phrase reindustrialize. He also thinks that, this is actually very important, he also thinks that tariff could be alternative revenue. Mm-hmm. He referred to the McKinley administration at the time when the United States doesn't have income tax at all. It's a whole federal government relies on tariffs as a revenue source. Mm-hmm. And he's thinking about that kind of a scenario. Especially, I think some of the people around him in his cabinet also believe in that theory as well. As a trained as economists, we all think this is ludicrous, but he really thinks this is a great solution. So I think he is conducting a grandiose social experiment, in my view, that eventually he does want to see a portion of the federal budget being financed by tariff revenues. He talks about hundreds of billions of dollars for that. So I think it's going to be a long-term issue here. We're not going to persuade him, successfully persuading him that tariff is a bad thing for both sides. It's a lose-lose situation. Mm-hmm. He doesn't think so. Let alone there's also I forgot to mention, there's also a national security angle. Yes. He thinks that there's a national security implication. There's a foreign policy angle that He wants to essentially build a wall around the United States. And
Tariff war here.
Tariff war, as well as actually from a foreign policy perspective, he wants to withdraw from the rest of the world, being more focused on United States, America first.
America first.
Yeah, he doesn't. He thinks the empire stretching thing. He buys into the U.S. Senator from Kentucky Rand Paul's argument that the United States empire is stretching too much, and the rest of the world is not paying for it, right? So there's that aspect as well. So I think it's a problem that the rest of the world have to deal with. We're not going to persuade him.
Oh, okay. We're not going not be able to persuade him. Radhika, if that's the way, that's the direction, what will happen, I mean, internationally? And besides, I mean, since you are in London now, what's the response from the Europeans, colleagues, friends in the UK or other European countries?
I think in Europe as well, there has been increasingly discussion on even, things like reopening the discussion on Europe's energy dependency and so on. In the United Kingdom, people are trying to take solace in the fact that the United Kingdom does not have a big goods trade deficit, and in fact it's or surplus with the United States, on the contrary, but it has a big services surplus, and Trump has not yet touched services. That's another whole issue to discuss. But I just wanted to say a couple of things. One, very quickly, Trump says that he likes tariffs. I mean, I agree with all the things that John said, but I would add that Trump says he likes tariffs because they're a better option than sanctions, which by weaponizing the dollar system will make the dollar system less attractive. But how is weaponizing trade going to help Trump or the United States? It's, so instead of weaponizing the dollar system, he's weaponizing trade in order to achieve, God knows, completely sham purposes. But anyway, the overall effect of this will actually be, in my humble opinion, to reduce the weight and importance of the United States in the world economy, because no country can deal with such an unreliable trading partner and economic partner. And more, he's creating real incentives for the rest of the world to find alternatives to being economically connected with the United States in every possible way.
Yeah, so Radhika, are you saying that countries like, of course, economies like China, BRICS countries, for example, or EU countries, somehow Asian countries, they can come together and form a kind of, you might call that alliance, and do business with each other or increase trade with each other, investment, in a way, to probably reduce the dependence on the US?
There are two elements to this. Number one, yes, that is in what you're talking about, increasing economic interpenetration of the BRICS economies, BRICS plus economies, etc. This is already ongoing. And this will probably accelerate. But there is a second element which has not been noticed as much. The head of the WTO was quoted recently as pointing out that between about the mid-90s and the mid-2000s, world trade was increasing faster than world GDP. Now, world GDP is growing faster than world trade. What that means is that more and more of what countries produce is being consumed at home. And honestly, people might say, oh, that's a bad thing. It's not such a bad thing. What is the purpose of having a big booming economy like China's if it is not to make ordinary Chinese people more prosperous in that they are able to consume more and higher quality goods and services that they are themselves capable of producing? And the same applies to other countries. So I would say that this export orientation and this trade dependence, I'm not saying that trade is not important, but if it goes down to more acceptable levels, why starve your own children in order to give goods for nothing to the United States, as the world has been doing for far too long?
Yeah.
So, let Chinese people consume more.
Okay, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thanks for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.